So let's cross back to East Africa, where Kenya secured a 6-month debt rescheduling deal with China this week on a $1.2 billion exim bank loan, of which some 30 billion shillings are due for repayment. But it's no longer news that the administration in Nairobi faces a difficult time on its fiscal side. So let's talk to the news this week. That's one news. We have a bit of others. Let's talk to George Bodo, who is a director at Callstreet Research and Analytics. He's joining us from Nairobi. Good evening, George. Welcome to the show.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm good. I'm here, my brother. It's good to see you. Thank you so much. Give us a fuller picture, George, of this 6 months debt relief deal between Kenya and China.
Kenya went for debt service suspension by some of its key bilateral creditors. And of course, they sought, the first group to approve was the Paris Club members. And they got a suspension for 6 months between January and June 30th to the tune of about 36 billion Kenya shillings, which is about just about $300 million. And that's for 6 months. And then they went to China, and China came out. They're not very, very categorical, and they're not very specific. But the Chinese embassy released a statement. The Chinese embassy in Nairobi released a statement, and they were not very specific. But the Minister of Finance said that received a waiver of about $27 billion, which is just roughly about $250 million. So in total, Kenya is looking at about $560 million waiver between now and June 30th.
What about the debt rescheduling between the administration and the G20 under the DSA side? Is this the deal with the Chinese, which has to do with it? There's a $1.4 billion or $1.2 billion that's due next week, Thursday, that Kenya has to pay up.
Yeah, so what is not very clear is whether this suspension includes interest and coupon, because the way the government debts is structured is in a bullet nature, where the final principal is paid at the end of the tenure. So based on that basis, this is probably interest payment. But also the problem is that the Chinese, specifically the Chinese debt, there's a lot of secrecy around them. Nobody really knows how they're structured and how the repayment structure, the repayment terms. We only know the tenure. And even the pricing sometimes is not even disclosed. So we don't know, because now Kenya's exposure to the Chinese government, the bilateral exposure is just about $6.5 billion for the infrastructure projects. So yes, we still don't know whether this payment suspension is for the one due next week, or it's for the previous exposure. So there's not much disclosure around this. But all we know that the Minister of Finance says they've secured a waiver from the Chinese government, the China Exim Bank to be specific, of about 250 million, 27 billion Kenya shillings, the equivalent of about $250 million.
What has the Kenyatta's administration been spending these loans on? Do you have any idea?
That's a very, I wish for that question, but there's a lot of debate around that. We still don't know. As I said, there's a lot of secrecy around this, and the government, I think one of the discussion around the IMF exposure right now is the government to provide more transparency on the debt documents and the utilization of debt proceeds, because as we speak, we don't know how much of those debts went into actual infrastructure spending and how much of them went into current expenditure. We've always suspected that a good portion of the debt procured over the last 5 years have gone into the current expenditures, but we don't know to what extent.
Aren't Kenyatta's administration building railways?
Yeah, they're building railways. They built railways, yes. They built a railway from Nairobi we call it railway to nowhere, because the way it ends, there's nothing. It ends in the bushes. So there's a lot of ridicule around where it ends.
What about the one to Mombasa?
Yeah, so there's a railway from the port city of Mombasa to the capital of Nairobi. It does one trip a day. I think now they're talking about 2 trips a day. And it's both for passenger and goods. the railway was extended to a city called Naivasha, which is just about 100 kilometers from Nairobi as you go to western side. And the point was that they needed to get a loan to do the railway up to the border with Uganda because they wanted to get the trucks off the road because the trucks are causing a lot of damage on the roads. But they were not able to procure money, a loan from the Chinese government for the third phase from the Naivasha dry port, they're calling it the dry port, to the border with Uganda. So at the moment, it ends nowhere, in the middle of nowhere.
So
but yes, to answer your question, they've built the railway, yes.
Yeah, but that means there's a need for more money. In simple English.
Yeah, but the Chinese said, no, we're not giving you more money.
Oh, really? Did they say so?
Yeah, they said no more money. They went there in 2019 and they were told no money, no money.
So the Kenyatta's administration has to pay up this debt we're talking about before Beijing could say, take another check.
Yes. So the point is that, and that is where the question is, we need to pay the loans. Every year we have to pay about $1 billion to Chinese government. And I think the next fiscal year we have to pay about $1.2 billion to the Chinese government. But the question is the utilization.
But does the administration have the money? It has $1 billion.
No, they don't have the money, by the way. Oh, by the way, talking about the money, whether they have it. So Treasury has just disclosed some statistics. They've just said that the first 6 months of the current fiscal year, which our fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. So the first 6 months from July 1st to December 31st, revenue collection came in. We've only collected about 42% of the full year target. And you would expect that by the first 6 months we've collected more than half of the full year target. The one we collected for 2%, and that means based on the normal run rate, they might only raise just north of 80% of what they've targeted. Now that's a disaster, by the way, big disaster for the government, because then they have to find the balance, and you have to feed in the almost 15-20% gap, and add that on top of your borrowing targets for the current year. So you're looking at a very, very weak fiscal trajectory for the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. It's a bit worrying.
Okay, but we've seen some steady inflows of external funds into Kenya's small businesses, like the current one that the International Finance Corporation is putting into Cooperative Bank. Are these funds reaching the businesses, and are they likely to make a real change for the people and for small businesses?
Yes, there's a lot of DFI funding coming into the country to support the SME world, because as you know that Kenya is an SME-driven economy, and SMEs have bore the biggest brunt for this. A lot of them have to close down shop or cut down capacity, send people home, and now the biggest problem now is how do you unlock funding for them so they can come back to production, and this is where the DFIs have come in. I think it's Cooperative Bank, KCB have gotten some chunk. Equity, which is probably the largest SME lender, also got some chunk. And I think, yes, these banks, I think for onward lending, I think you're likely to see some impact. The only thing they need to do is to lower the risk requirement for some of these SMEs for now, because obviously it's a different environment, and it's a difficult environment, and they have to lower their risk requirements for some of these the SMEs. But I think you answer your question, yes, I think we're likely to see some impact, SME support from that point. But I think you really expected a lot from the government towards the resuscitating SME businesses. The government has been talking for a long time over an SME guarantee scheme. They've just started operationalizing, but I think it's too late. They should have done it 3 years ago. And I think this is something that the government has really failed on, in my view.
George, quick one. How are the banks coping with the impact of this pandemic on their clientele in the area of loans repayment?
Yeah, it's a tough one for them. On the household side, they've had to give moratoriums. Some of the moratoriums expired in December 31st. I think some of them probably have had to roll over some of these moratoriums. And that's the only way they've dealt with these things, giving moratoriums, repayment holidays. But I'm just worried that that the impact could be much bigger on the balance sheet, especially on the household and the SME side. You are dealing with people who probably have been laid off, and the Statistics Bureau said you have about close to 2 million people who had to be laid off the jobs last year. That's a big number.
Okay.
SMEs have cut down on production.
Yes, George, I'm sure the bank's reporting season is yet to come on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. That will start coming very soon. So maybe when the fourth quarter of last year and full year numbers come in, we've got to talk to you again when your earnings season comes through. That will be a big time for those big news. Thank you so much. Have a great evening. Enjoy your weekend.